The unsurpassed, penetrating and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it, we can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Today we're going to talk about Ananda, the second ancestor. Ananda asked Mahakasho, "My elder brother in the Dharma, when the world-honored one transmitted the kesa of gold brocade to you, did he pass on anything else?" Mahakasho called out, "Ananda." When Ananda acknowledged the call, Mahakasho said, "Chop down the flagpole in front of your temple gate." And Ananda awakened to his true self. Ananda was the Buddha's younger cousin, and everybody liked him. His name means joy. It said he was unsurpassed in learning as well as quick in memory and bright. And for 20 years he was the Buddha's attendant. I've always had a soft spot for Ananda, partly because of this. I was one of Reverend Master Jihu's assistants, and I know what it's like. It's not easy to be the assistant of one's teacher. And in fact, most of the ancestors were the assistant of their teacher before they went off to teach on their own. But Ananda really did it in spades. He was a Buddha's assistant for 20 years, and then 20 years Mahakasho's assistant. So he put in a lot of time as an attendant. And because Ananda was with the Buddha all the time during the Buddha's lifetime, he heard all his teachings and he memorized them. He had one of those memories that doesn't forget anything, remembers everything. It said he would remember word for word what the Buddha said. But in spite of this, the Buddha didn't give Ananda his kesa and his recognition. He doesn't make him the first ancestor. He gave it to Mahakasho, and he asked Ananda to assist Mahakasho, the first ancestor. And as Kezan says, at the same time that Shakyamuni transmitted the eye and treasury of the true law to Mahakasho, he also entrusted, but did not transmit it, to Ananda, saying, "Please assist him in his transmission of it." So Ananda was Mahakasho's assistant for the next 20 years. So we might be wondering, well, what was it that the Buddha gave to Mahakasho that he didn't give to Ananda? What did he pass on to Mahakasho? If you remember the story of the Buddha holding up a flower, and Mahakasho understands and smiles, and the Buddha sees this and says, "I have the eye and treasury of the true law which I transmit to Mahakasho." It's Mahakasho who understands and smiles. It's not the Buddha singling him out to give him something. Mahakasho is ready, he understands. And the Buddha sees this and gives him his recognition, and then eventually gives him the kesa. Mahakasho understands what the Buddha understands. But it's there for everybody. It's not the Buddha taking him aside and giving him something secret and special. It's there for everyone. Everyone sees. But Mahakasho is there ready to receive it. And Kezan says, it should be evident that the way of the ancestors and masters is different from the other Buddhist traditions. Ananda was already the one who had heard most of what the Buddha had taught, had broad learning, and was quite erudite. Many were the times when the Buddha personally expressed his approval of him, even though he had not yet transmitted the true law to him, since he had not yet clarified what the foundation of his mind was. He's not lacking something, he's just not quite ready. And then there's the story of the elders getting ready for the first council after the Buddha's death. And because Ananda is not an arahant, they won't let him in. Mahakashoya won't let him into his quarters. But Ananda is the one who remembers all the Buddha's teachings, and they need him. So he's really up against it. He needs to be an arahant to go to the council, and he's not one, and they need him. I think we can all sympathize with Ananda here. He's in a bit of a spot. So, as Kezan said, reflecting upon this in private, I bet he was reflecting upon it. Reflecting upon this in private, Ananda suddenly realized the fruits of arahanthood. And when he then sought to enter, Mahakashoya said, if you have now realized for certain, you should be able to enter through a display of your spiritual powers. Ananda made himself very small so that he might enter by the keyhole. That is, says Reverend Master Hubert, his display of genuine humility served as the key to unlock the door for him. And he thus entered Hippara Cave after all. He was able to attend the council. So it's all okay. Everything's okay. The display of his spiritual powers is just Ananda's genuine humility. This is Reverend Master Hubert's interpretation, but it makes perfect sense. And let's bear in mind that by this time, Ananda's been training for 40 years. It's just not an overnight thing. It suddenly thinks, oh, I think I need to be an arahant. Let's just try it. He's been training for 40 years, but he's just really pushed to the wall. And he understands. So he comes to the first council. He was invited to repeat all the Buddha's teachings, which he does. And all the other disciples praised him, saying, the waters of the great ocean of the Buddha Dharma have flowed into you. What Ananda proclaimed is, even now, the flowing forth and passing on of what the Tathagata had preached. It's the basis of the words of the Buddha that has actually come down to us even today. So it is said. And Kezan goes on. We know for a fact that this way of ours does not depend on how much you have heard, or on having realized for certain, as this instance should make evident. This is important. It's not just realization. It's not dependent on how much we've heard, on our erudition, nor is it dependent just on realization. We also have to train ourselves to hear the Dharma, put it into practice, do the work on ourselves. Otherwise there's no context, and we don't train our selfishness. Both understanding and practice, just daily, mundane practice of relinquishment, giving up selfishness. The true humility, that's the spiritual power, just not being a big self. Not woo-woo stuff. And he goes on. Ananda attended on Mahakashoya for 20 years, but did not have a great awakening to his true self until the occasion cited in the opening story. Since he'd been born on the night when the Tathagata realized enlightenment, he hadn't heard the preaching of such scriptures as the Avatamsaka scripture. Even so, once he had entered the samadhi that a Buddha awakens to, he could relate even what he had not heard directly. His earlier lack of success in entering the way of the Buddha's ancestors and masters is not one bit different from our own failure to enter it. This is very comforting. Is that he had to, it took so long, he had to work so hard, and somehow was missing it or thinking he lacked something. Is not a little bit different from our own struggles and seeming failures. Kezan tells us that Ananda had trained alongside Shakyamuni in the distant past, in some distant life. But he was fond of accumulating knowledge, and therefore he took longer to realize enlightenment. And he says, you must really understand that pursuit of learning, as evinced here, is an obstacle on the path to enlightenment, which is why it says in the Avatamsaka scripture, pursuit of erudition, by analogy, is like a greedy pauper who keeps counting up the treasures of others whilst having not a halfpenny of his own. If you intend to settle the matter of enlightenment point blank, do not be partial to the pursuit of erudition, but forthwith be daring, brave, and persistent in your training to make great efforts in the way, and yet not grasping after enlightenment. Now Keizan moves on to something else. Ananda is certain that there's something more than the Kesa that the Buddha passed on to Mahakasho. So he asks him. And he says, "My elder brother in the Dharma, when the world-honored one transmitted the Kesa brocade to you, did he pass on anything else?" Mahakasho recognized that the critical moment had been reached and called out, "Ananda." When Ananda acknowledged this, Mahakasho in response said, "Chop down the flagpole in front of your temple gate." And responding to his voice, Ananda awakened to his true self, and the Buddha's Kesa descended naturally onto Ananda's head. Mahakasho doesn't give Ananda something. He calls out, "Ananda." And Ananda says, "Yes," an immediate response. And then Mahakasho says, "Chop down your flagpole. Let go of all this erudition and being somebody. Just let go." And Ananda realizes the true self for himself. Even the Kesa, the confirmation of his realizing the truth, Mahakasho doesn't give it to him. It comes to him naturally. This is important. It's not giving some secret thing. Ananda just receives it for himself. He wakes up for himself, as Mahakasho did. Now, this story about the flagpole sounds a bit different from the story of Ananda going off and reflecting in private about being kept out of the first council because he's not an arahant. But really, one doesn't stand against the other, because it's a matter of letting go of a self invested in something. Erudition, argument, being somebody who has something or knows a lot. And although Ananda had all this knowledge, he still felt he was lacking something. And then when he finally lets go of all of this, what he has, what he doesn't have, his erudition, being somebody, being an Ananda, when he finally lets it all go, chops down his flagpole, then he understands for himself. Keizan explains about the flagpole. In India, the custom was that when the Buddha's disciples entered into a debate with non-Buddhists, both sides would raise a flag. When one side was bested, their flag was taken down. The defeat was thereby signaled, without recourse to sounding drums and bells. You don't have to make a big noise about somebody being defeated. They just quietly took their flag down. And in today's story, too, it's as though Mahakasho and Ananda had raised flags in debate. Raising the flags. And the debate, like with Buddha's Ananda, it's one against the other, and it's not about the real truth. You can't have two flags up and have the truth, because the truth is not about argument. And Mahakasho just says, "Stop it, let it go, chop it down," and then there's the truth. And the point is that Ananda has to relinquish his erudition and knowledge and all that. There's probably some pride in it, although he feels he lacks something. He probably is a little bit proud of his erudition and knowledge and having been the Buddha's attendant for 20 years and heard all his teachings and so on and so forth. And when he does this, when he chops down his flagpole, lets it all go, realizes the true self, as it were, then he learns true humility. He can make himself small enough to enter the keyhole. He can relinquish that pride or whatever it would have been. And after that, when he's relinquished attachment to what he knows and so forth, being the Buddha's attendant and all that, after that, he can make true use of his ability to memorize all that the Buddha taught, without there being a self in the way. So much so that the other disciples all said that it was just like the Buddha himself speaking. There's no Ananda in the way. It's the words of the Buddha coming forth clearly without an Ananda being there to interpret or just be a self in the way. He just lets it forth. And now Ananda really understands the teaching for himself. He's not just giving voice to it for the benefit of other people. He understands it for himself. And as Keizan says, only after he had attended on Margakasho as his follower and had his great awakening, did he once again proclaim the teachings, and it was just like fire uniting with fire. Buddha nature with Buddha nature. Understanding with understanding. Keizan talks at some length about the fact that the transmission of the Dharma, transmission of the truth, is something separate from doctrine. Because otherwise Ananda, who knew all the Buddha's teachings better than anyone, would have been the first ancestor rather than the second. But he's the second ancestor. And he says, Keizan says, you must grasp that realization does not depend on erudition and broad learning. Because you are sharp of mind and keen of ear, you may be able to hear, comprehend and retain all manner of books and sacred teachings without leaving out even a single word. But if you fail to penetrate to their essence, you are like the one who vainly counts his neighbor's treasures. It is not that this essence does not exist in scriptures and doctrinal teachings, but regretfully, Ananda had not yet penetrated to it. He could speak it, he could give voice to it, he could remember it and pass it on, but he hadn't yet penetrated it for himself. And he says, how much more do people in China and Japan try to unlock meaning by depending on the words and fail to get to the essence of scriptures? And in America and the West, listening to the words, so many words we have now, and it helps us, and yet we have to do the training, we have to do the daily work for ourselves. Reading about the Dharma does not do it for us, as we know. Now Keizan says, clearly, if you want to participate in the true way, discard your false view of self, as well as your old emotions, pride and arrogance, and turn the naive mind you had as a child to meeting with the Buddha's wisdom. Meeting with the Buddha's wisdom. Not getting it. Meeting with the Buddha's wisdom. You're not acquiring something. Discarding our false view of self and our old emotions, pride and arrogance. This is the point. It's not just about erudition. It's about anything we hold on to as me. Our false view of self. Our old emotions. Fears, resentments, despair. Our history, our story, our clinging to things long gone. They may arise. We may need to see them. They may keep coming up. And yet, we have to let them go as well. Let them come up, let them abide, let them pass away. Don't cling on, don't push them away. Just let them come and go. Not to hold them onto as me, this is what I am. Our pride and arrogance, I have all this knowledge or competence, or I'm such and such a person. We were talking about this the other day. I'm a such and such. Holding on to that as what I am. And our inadequacy as well, which is the other side of pride. I'm lacking something. I don't have what it takes. I'm not as good as other people. I can't do it. Ananda felt he was lacking something. And as Keizan says in the very next chapter, thinking we're lacking something and we can't do it, of all foolish ideas, this is the most foolish. He rages at us for even thinking we can't do this training, although he keeps telling us how huge it is, how hard it is. Even Buddhas and ancestors find it hard, and going beyond all these things we can't possibly even imagine. But to think we can't do it, of all foolish ideas, this is the most foolish. Okay. We need to discard all these things, all these ideas about ourselves, what we can and can't do, what we are, what we have been, and turn the naive mind we had as a child to meeting with the Buddha's wisdom, meeting with it. We don't lack anything. There isn't some special secret thing that Mahakashoya was given and Ananda wasn't. And even the Kesa, the confirmation that he had indeed finally realized the truth for himself, came to Ananda naturally. Nobody had to give it to him. It came to him naturally. He met with the Buddha's wisdom, understood for himself. And Kezan goes through the story about the flagpole and Ananda's awakening for yet a third time, because he's still trying to point to something deeper that's going on. The call and the response. Ananda isn't trying to be somebody. He's just simply responding with the naive mind of a child, just innocently, automatically. Yes, meeting with the Buddha's wisdom. Not being separate, not getting something, just meeting with it. Unexpectedly. And he says, Ananda had a great awakening to his true self because master and disciple had merged in the way. That which is beyond the individual people concerned, they had merged in the way. Is not a person Mahakashoya and a person Ananda. Something beyond the individuals that they both knew. They had merged in it. Kezan says, now don't get stuck here, standing like a huge wall. Don't get stuck with ideas of purity. I must be pure and clean. He says, go on further and know it for yourself. He says, this is all that matters. It being transmitted by it. Buddha nature being transmitted by Buddha nature. Ultimately, it is not what people think it is, he says. It's not a person giving something to another person. It's beyond the individual people concerned. It's beyond our own little minds to grasp. And yet, something in us does understand, but not with our little brains. It's beyond the little separate self, with its ideas of what it is and what it can do and can't do. And he goes on. Although the globs of red flesh, which have manifested as Mahakashoya and Ananda, have appeared in the world, both as one face and as two faces of that person, in caps. The globs of red flesh, meaning human beings. He's mentioned this before in other places. The globs of red flesh. It doesn't sound very attractive, but that's what we are, little globs of red flesh. And I think of Reverend Master Jiu's lava lamp. She loved lava lamps. And there was one big one that was her favorite. And the bulb in the bottom would be turned on. It would heat up, warm up the water. And the red goo at the bottom would begin to bubble. And big red globs would start to emerge from the red goo and take some kind of shape and go upwards to the top. And eventually they'd cool and they'd come back down again, become part of the red goo at the bottom. And she loved this because this is her analogy for life. We take shape, globs of red flesh, we come up, we live for a while, and then we decay, go back down into the red goo. Like Kezan in the waves, it's just the same thing. The water in the waves, we're just waves on the ocean. We're just blobs of red goo taking shape, rising up, going back down into the primordial goo. And this is what he's telling us. He says, where are we? Although the globs of red flesh, which have manifested as Mahakashoya and Ananda, have appeared in the world, both as one face and as two faces of that person, do not consider that just Mahakashoya and Ananda are of that person. Each and every one of you here now is a wall soaring up 8,000 feet. One of the 1,000 changes and 10,000 transformations of that person. All rising up, becoming, taking shape, living our life, going back into the goo, the ocean. Ocean sounds better than goo. If you become conscious of that person, you will all, in a twinkling, completely disappear from view. So do not seek outside yourselves for a flagpole to chop down. Don't go looking for something. Don't add something extra. Don't get into the judgmental mind, looking for something outside oneself. I'm lacking something. Above all, don't think we lack something, that there's something exclusive that's passed on from one special person to another special person, and we don't have it, or that we can't realize the truth for ourselves. Of all foolish ideas, this is the most foolish. As Keizan tells us throughout the whole of the Denkoroku, we all have the light of Buddha. We are all part of the great ocean of Buddha nature, waves on the ocean of Buddha nature. Never to doubt this. The teaching of the Denkoroku is for us. And he says, today, this Japanese descendant of the Mahayana tradition of Daijo Monastery wishes once again to append his words. Would you all like to hear them? When the vines have withered, the trees have fallen, and the mountains have crumbled away, the valley stream in cascades will gush beyond its banks, and the very rock will pour forth fire. Homage to all the Buddhas and all worlds. Homage to all the Bodhisattvas and all worlds. Homage to the scripture of great wisdom.